Today is March 8th, 2022, and I want to let listeners know about two reading opportunities in advance of upcoming episodes in the next month or so. I'm going to be talking about Greed in Tolstoy and Adam Smith, using the Tolstoy story Master and Man. So please consider reading that story in advance. And Dwayne Betts is going to be returning to EconTalk to discuss Primo Levi and Ralph Ellison and their books, If This Is a Man by Levi and Levi's book, The Truce, alongside Ellison's book, Invisible Man. You might want to do some of that reading in advance. We'll have links to those books on the page for today's episode. I want to thank Plantronics for providing today's guest with the Blackwire 5220. And now that guest, Pano Kanelos, the founding president of the UATX, a university to be established in Austin, Texas. Pano, welcome to EconTalk.
A great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You became a university president in 2017 at an unusual college, St. John's. Tell our listeners what's distinctive about St. John's and what it's like being a college president, something I've also become.
Sure. Well, St. John's College is a rather distinctive place, even in the kind of, the United States has sort of an infinite variety of types of colleges, universities, secular, faith-based, small, large, technically oriented, liberal arts focused. And in that landscape, St. John's stands out. St. John's is the third oldest college in the United States. It was founded in 1696. So actually before there was a United States. It was Harvard, William and Mary, and then St. John's. And it's maintained its legacy of being a kind of premier liberal arts institution since that time. In the 1930s, 1937, St. John's made its move towards a very distinctive curriculum, which is called the New Program. It's still called the New Program all these years later. And the New Program was an attempt to harness, let's say, the energy of the great books movement that was nascent at the time. Mortimer Adler and others were promoting the great books as a kind of antidote to the what they saw as the kind of anodyne, soulless universities that had sort of given up on the focus of thinking about the great human questions and were focusing more on kind of narrow disciplinary research. So the curriculum at St. John's is essentially a single curriculum for all students, all undergraduates. The undergraduates are there for 4 years, and they essentially read their way through about 200 great books, mostly from the Western tradition, beginning in the ancient world and making their way to the modern world. Although at St. John's, the modern world stops at around 1950. Doesn't get much past that. It's a really comprehensive curriculum, though. I mean, oftentimes when you mention the liberal arts, people think you're talking about the humanities exclusively. But the liberal arts do encompass the humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, essentially all forms of knowledge. And so the St. John's curriculum is structured like that. There's you will do seminars and tutorials in mathematics, in languages. You do 2 years of Greek, 2 years of French, in music, in philosophy, in physics. In the natural sciences like biology. But all these subjects are tackled through original text, through great books. For example, the very first mathematics tutorial that freshmen take, they read Euclid. That's how you start. You start studying geometry by actually going back and reading Euclid and beginning with the fundamental and first question that Euclid asks, which is, what is a point? That's sort of philosophical question, like what is a point? Like what is that thing that we call a point, and beginning from there outwards. The instruction is almost universally conversational, Socratic, around a table. There are some hands-on labs, but those also generate conversation, and it's some music performance, choral performance, and that. But it's a place that's really stayed true to its original vision, that you gather together a group of intellectually ambitious students and faculty, and you read books together and talk about them.
And we've had Zena Hitz on the program, who's a tutor at St. John's. You don't have professors there. I think you have tutors, people who lead those conversations. Shlom College, where I'm the president, has similar aspirations. We do not do education exactly the way that St. John's does. But we do believe deeply in the reading of great texts when possible around a small table with a small group of students. And that's very special. You could argue there are many things in life that you'd like to know about that are best delivered in a is a lecture. But I would focus on the question and ask you, what happens to a person who goes through that for 4 years of that particular kind of small group conversation, grappling with those great texts? Is it, what's it do to your brain?
That's a great question. When you're in a position of always having to discuss the text that you're reading, as opposed to sort of passively accept something called a lecture, right? So you have a kind of constant sense of involvement and agency. Over time, that develops in a kind of intensely critical faculty. Your ratiocinative powers, muscle is really, really strengthened. And, I would often say that after 4 years of reading these books, and they're difficult books. I mean, you're reading the papers of Einstein, you're Lobachevsky, these students are reading, musical theory rather than just, how to sing notes. They're studying ancient languages. But doing all this, I think after a while, produces a graduate who can, this may sound a little trite, but I like the phrase, sort of solve the Rubik's Cube of life. Right. So what do you end up becoming? A problem solver, somebody who's grappling with very difficult questions and trying to find your way forward towards answers that are better than the ones that you started with. And, graduates of St. John's, I think, are outfitted to do that well beyond their college experience. They tend to go in many, many fields, but whether they go into finance or the academy or sciences or politics, what they're primarily seen as are people who can identify and solve for thorny issues and problems. And so I think that's what it produces. The critical muscle that's essential to a flourishing life.
Yeah, Leon Cass sometimes summarizes, the dean of faculty here, and I know a longtime friend of yours and mine, it produces thoughtful people. And that sounds kind of blasé on a certain level and deeply profound on another. I often say that if you come to Shlom College, you learn how to think, read, write, and listen. And that last one is not obvious to most people, but when you sit around a table with 20 people in a contentious conversation about Plato or any aspect of what is a life well lived, or what does a text really mean, or what's its implication for us today or our country, it gets lively, and you have to learn how to be respectful of others if it's taught well. But you do confront the problem that you don't have a barcode on your forehead when you leave St. John's or Shlom College that says, I am now fit to be a dentist, or fill in the blank, a software engineer, an accountant. You have not learned a formal set of pre-professional skills, which increasingly is what college is about, right? There's an enormous number of students who major in business, engineering, STEM generally, science, technology, engineering, and math. Those are all wonderful. I have no problem with them. But when you get a liberal arts education, which is strongly oriented toward the humanities, you don't have an easy label to put on yourself. Now, what we find here at Shlom is that our students are in great demand, despite the fact that they don't have the label. But it's reasonable that a young person in advance of attending such a place would be anxious about that. So it tends to attract, I think, potentially students who aren't worried about whether they're going to be able to do anything when they get out, only to discover that they can do something. At least that's our experience here. I'm curious what you noticed there.
Oh, so many things to talk about. So let me unpack a little bit. So first of all, having the barcode on your forehead to scan your sort of qualifications for what comes next. I'm not sure that most conventional academic programs actually provide that either. I mean, the things we call majors, the things we call degrees, I don't know that most of them line up perfectly with professional life that follows. That, I mean, in some technical fields they do.
Not at all. Most,
yeah.
I agree with you, but at least the resume has a thing at the top that looks like it's related to a thing in the real world. That's all I really meant. Sorry.
And I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think that perception, I would say, I think the perception of the value of that is changing, even on the end of those who are hiring young people. I mean, they're not, the idea that degrees narrowly construed are somehow a qualification. I think the age of the college degree is coming to an end. Which is a different discussion. But I do think, as you say with Shlom College, the graduates of St. John's are highly sought after. And I think it's because those who are familiar with the college understand that it is an intensely rigorous education. And so whatever you're doing for 4 years, it's really challenging and hard. And students who graduate it's an achievement to graduate in a program like that. And so I think that's the primary quality that many graduate schools or employers are looking for. Graduates who are capable of pushing through a very rigorous academic program, whatever the content of that program might be. I'd like to return for a second though to you mentioned, being able to listen is a primary quality that's produced by Shlom, and I think by St. John's as well. At St. John's, we had only 2 rules for the classroom. One was that every opinion must be heard, so you have to listen, no matter what, And the second was that every opinion must be backed up by evidence. So you can speak, you can be heard, but you also have to provide evidence, and then that gives somebody something to respond to. And so there is a kind of intense quality of listening that you find in a St. John's seminar. But even more than that, you mentioned how things can get contentious and loud. The thing that was most shocking to me when I first joined that community, and I started to, I was a tutor myself, even though I was president, so I was involved in seminars and tutorials and that. The thing that most shocked me was the silence in the classroom. At St. John's, there can be extended periods of silence in the middle of a discussion because somebody will make a point and the students, the tutors, are often processing what's said and trying to be thoughtful before they respond. And sometimes that silence extends, 20, 30 seconds, maybe a minute. And for somebody like me, and I'm just a loud Greek guy, it was excruciating until I became accustomed to it, because you would want to jump in and, there's something's wrong. I'm in a classroom, I have students, and yet nobody's saying anything. That seemed to me to be a problem. And what I realized later on is it was a feature.
Yeah.
It was a feature.
It's one of the great, I think, innovations of modern sports announcing. It took a long time for people to appreciate it, but a lot of sports announcing, especially over the radio, is filling the space and the time and making sure that there's no dead air, as it's called. And Vin Scully, the announcer for the Dodgers, I think he's recognized as the person who really started to do this. I think when after one of Sandy Koufax's, maybe one of his perfect games. He had one perfect game, I think. Or after the Gibson home run in the World Series, which was just so dramatic, he just doesn't say anything. He doesn't fill the time. And so as the participant, you're filling the time with your own thoughts. You're hearing the roar of the crowd if you're on the radio, or you're watching on TV, you're watching the moment. And I think a great announcer, just like a great tutor, maybe even a great podcast host, knows that sometimes silence is golden. It's the right thing to allow to fill the time.
And I think that may be what Leon, Mr. Cass, meant by an education that produces thoughtful people, because thought has to happen in time. And when we're always jumping in and we're always responding, and the noise, the static noise of the world that we live in is kind of overwhelming us. You have to be able to pull back from that and give yourself the opportunity to develop thought. And so I think silence is an indicator, not always, but an indicator that thought may be happening.
Yeah. We're recording this in the middle of the Russian-Ukraine war. It'd be amazing if it was the middle. It may be near the end. It may be very much near the beginning. But talking to a friend right before we got on the line together, you and I, everyone's jumped in instantly, and they seem to have forgotten that real life is not Twitter. It's a mistake on Twitter to respond too quickly. It's really a mistake to respond to an invasion too quickly from the outside. A lot of people are not giving a lot of thought to what their suggestions or actions might lead to. It's a fascinating moment, but I do think our culture, I'm not making a deep point here about the world's response to this horrible invasion. I'm just really making a point about our eagerness often to jump in with a comment or an action, and thought is a thinking first seems like a really good idea. I want to ask you about the curriculum, and we have the similar issue here at Shlom. Our students read Homer, they read Plato and Aristotle, they read the Chumash, the Jewish Bible, the Talmud, commentary on the Bible, and Jewish law as part of their heritage. It's not a religious institution. It's part of their heritage as citizens of the Jewish state of Israel. And a lot of people would say, well, those books were, they were good a long time ago. Shakespeare, I mean, I can't even really understand him. I mean, come on. What do you say to people when they, I mean, can't we find something more modern and better? Why are we reading these old books? I mean, Euclid? Come on.
Well, I mean, the first thing that I would challenge is the idea that modern equals better. All right, that's a particular kind of notion. I mean, it's really strange. I mean, if you think about the fact that we call the period that we live in the modern period, on the one hand, what we mean is, this is the period of, well, we mean lots of things, right? But it's the period of now, the period that we live in. But by calling it modern, there's also a value judgment that somehow this nowness, this present moment, is qualitatively better than what's come before. Sort of fetishize the present and the modern period and assume that everything that's come before is somehow compromised in one way or another. But I mean, I think the world that we live in today, the wars that we continue to have, the strife that we have, clearly indicates that we have not achieved any degree of human perfection and maybe not significant degrees of human progress. So I think we have to think about that. So I think, why turn to old books? Why turn to things that predate us? Part of the reason is they are hard. And just the exercise of trying to work through something that's not easy. It's like foreign travel. You travel to places that are different from the one you came from because it's stimulating and challenging, or it should be. And in that experience, you both experience what the location has to offer, but it also gives you an opportunity for growth or transformation. This is what happens in Shakespeare. In the comedies, there's a kind of dynamic of beginning somewhere. So the comedies begin somewhere familiar, usually a court or a city or a town or a manor house of some sort. There's a problem that needs to be solved, and the main characters travel. They go out into what Northrop Frye called the green world, often some unfamiliar space, somewhere where their identities are challenged, where their ideas are sort of refreshed, and then they return back to the original location, transformed as human beings. I think that's what books provide for us, as well as travel. That a book is a kind of journey into a green world, a place that is not our place, that where identities aren't exactly aligned with our identities, and they force us to reflect upon our own life, our own situations, the questions we ask, and that's immensely valuable. So reading old books can provide that kind of experience. I would also say, in terms of understanding who we are in the moment in which we live, most of these books we qualify as great. And I don't necessarily think there are the great books. I think there are great books. And none of that, you can't capture the totality of all great books in any kind of curriculum. But let's say books that we qualify as great are books that have generally had significant impact on the culture in which we live, the world in which we live. So they've been kind of absorbed into the bloodstream. So understanding, the way, for example, Shakespeare thought about kingship is to also understand the way the British and other Europeans think about kingship over time. And and how that how political regimes evolved into what we have today. That's part of this story. So understanding these older texts is to understand the story that predates us, but is also our story.
If I could just weigh in on this, because those are the two answers. I give variants of that. Those are beautiful. I like to think about Faulkner in his Nobel Prize address, where he talks about great art being about the human heart in conflict with itself. In many ways, that's the essence of life. The human heart in conflict with itself. There are things you want that you think maybe aren't so good for you. There are things you'd like to want that you don't want, that you might grow to like. If you worked at it, you have urges to do things that you recognize as wrong or that come with a cost or a price. And how do you deal with that? And great literature, for example, like the Iliad or the Odyssey, deals with those kind of dilemmas. And to continue this, the sports reference, we like to talk about, could Babe Ruth, would he be a good, how would he do against a pitcher who could throw 100 miles an hour? Could he be able, what would it be like? And what's great about literature is that Babe Ruth's still playing. Homer was really good at the human heart in conflict with itself. And it's true, it's a little bit archaic, might be the language in the case of Shakespeare, or it's a poem in the case of Homer, which makes it a little less accessible than it might be if it were written as a children's story. But of course, it also makes it better. Often, the eloquence of it moves you and forces you to internalize it in a way you wouldn't if someone just told you what it meant. And that's the part of the challenge that you were talking about. I think it allows you to own it. And to use the line that Agnes Callard used on EconTalk, learn how to talk to dead people. And so you're talking with the people around you in the room, but also in conversation with the author. And that's a transcendent human experience. So I think it's a value in and of itself. I think it's one of the most extraordinary things that we can experience as a human being that lifts us above the material and the physical. But I do think it's useful. I think it's powerful. And the way I would think of it, you talked about as sort of problem solving. That goes too far for me. I think most of the interesting challenges in life you don't solve. You just deal with them, grapple with them, do the best you can. And you get answers. You don't answer the problem. You get better answers than you might otherwise find, or that are more comforting, or that are more human. But I think when I think about what a great education is, it's transforming your brain to apply what you know to things you haven't seen before. And it's clear to me, to do that, you need facts and information. The facts and information by themselves, which are mainly what are communicated in a lecture format. A great lecture can do more than that. A great lecture can open your brain. But the classroom seminar style grappling that we're talking about, almost by definition, forces you to internalize it in a way and have it be useful to you, synthesize it with other things you've read and learned, and allows you to have an understanding, not just a factual knowledge, an understanding, which is such a deeper idea. It means that you can use the knowledge and apply it to things, see its relevance to other things that you wouldn't otherwise notice. And I think that's what's at the heart of this kind of education when it's delivered well.
I couldn't agree more. And you put it much better than I could do so myself. I would say, the heart of what you're saying, which I agree with, is that the purpose of education is not the acquisition of knowledge. It's the acquisition of wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well said.
Right? And so what do you do? Yes, we learn things. We can apprehend facts. There's content, that. But so what? It's sort of all swirling around there. What do we do with this? What choices do we make? What further questions do we ask? And I do think, to return to the challenges that challenging text present, the kind of attention that we talked before about listening. Right? You have to listen to the text too on their own terms, right? You can't run through these texts. You can't shout at them. They have something to say to you, and oftentimes you have to take it carefully and slowly. And I'll give you a real quick example just from last night. So I have a son in 7th grade, 12 years old, and they're doing Macbeth in their literature class, and so they're performing short scenes in little groups, and he drew the short straw. So he's Macbeth in his scene. And so we were kind of going over his lines. And it's early in the play when he meets the weird sisters, witches. And as he kind of comes across them, he says, "Stay," right? And then continues on the line. And my son said, "Why does he say stay?" I said, "Well, what do you think he means?" And he said, "Well, he means stop, you know." And I said, "Well, what's the difference between stop and stay? What does stay imply that stop might not?" And he was thinking about it, and he said something along the lines of, "Well, it sounds more like he wants them to spend time with him, like he wants them to remain because he has something to say or do to them, as opposed to just stop them on some sort of forward progress." And I thought that's exactly right. And just that brief, interpretive conversation that we had about literature, I think, gave us a moment to think about it. And then, of course, that opens up the question, well, why would he be so eager to have them around? They're witches, they have good, they're this and that. And so, you start thinking about the psychology of Macbeth in the moment of that, but it's listening to the text. It's taking your time with it so that it presents to you questions that you have to, grapple with, stumble forward with, etc.
Listeners may not know, Pano, that you're a Shakespeare scholar. So the only thing this reminds me of is Bill James. My last sports reference probably for this conversation, but Bill James, the person who really invented the application of statistical techniques to baseball, revealed on this program that he was a Little League coach. And I found that very amusing. I find this equally, and he said he got yelled at a lot by the other parents. And I'm thinking, do they know who they're talking to? So, if the teacher, I can imagine the teacher telling your son, no, it just means stop. And your son saying, well, my dad says.
Well, actually.
Anyway, now there are many ways to learn. The classroom is one, life is another. I have found my first year on the job here as president of a college to be shockingly educational, a little bit traumatically so, but mostly for the good. How did being a president of a college change you? Or teach you?
I teach, I think, is a better formulation. The way that Eva Brand, who's the most senior tutor at St. John's, described the work of the president to me when I first got her. She sort of took me under her wing and wanted to make sure that I understood the culture of St. John's, its history, and there was nobody who better embodies it than her. And she said, look, because I had been a dean before this. So I was a dean of an honors college, a great books honors college at Valparaiso University. And she said, look, the job of the dean is to preserve the essence of the college. The job of the president is to preserve the existence of the college. So the essence, existence, right? And so suddenly I was on that side of an equation, and I'd always lived on the other side, right? I know I'd been a professor, and teacher, dean, academic, and that scholar. And suddenly, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is weighty. This is weighty. To be responsible for the existence of an institution. It's intimidating. And, not that all the work falls on the shoulders of the president, but ultimately you are claiming a kind of ultimate responsibility for the things, for the challenges that you face, the decisions that are made. And what it taught me was that every decision has to be informed by first principles. Everything has to kind of circle back to what is the purpose of this institution? Why is it here? And anything that conflicts with that needs to be treated with caution. And this can be something, major, like, when you're talking about curricular changes or admissions policies with faculty, and like you sort of circle back to the first principles. It could be something financial. For example, St. John's has a very consistent commitment to not hiring adjunct faculty. Right, that if you're a tutor at St. John's, you're full time. Sometimes they have tutors who are there for a period of time and not on the tenure track, but they're full time and they're paid the same as tutors. They're brought into the community, and that when you're a president trying to meet a budget, adjunct faculty is a shortcut. I mean, that's what a lot of presidents do. You kind of hire in these, you bring in the hired guns, and you pay them less than you pay the faculty, and it's a way to sort of square the circle. And when we were, as all colleges do, sort of struggling with financial matters at St. John's, the temptation that any college president would be to go down that route to some extent. But the first principles of the place don't allow it. It's not the kind of place. So you have to find another way to get to where you need to go. So I think that's what I learned, is that every institution is the existence of every institution is predicated upon maintaining the essence of the institution.
Yeah, I think a lot about Nassim Nicholas Taleb, frequent EconTalk guest. And one thing I learned from him, which is easy to learn as a maxim, but very hard to learn as a strategy for life, is avoid downside risk. Don't focus on the average because it doesn't apply to you every time. You get an actual draw from the urn, and if the draw is death, bankruptcy, etc., you don't get to keep playing and earn the average. And that's a very simple insight, very hard to remember in life often. And fairly early in my tenure here, I realized that was my job. Exactly what you said. Got to keep the place, keep the lights on. And that seems, of course, yeah, sure. That's part of it. Of course, you have to keep the light. You have to keep the place going. But it changes the way you think about it. A lot of people pressured me early on to talk about what our measure of success would be here at Shlom. And I came up with a very unsatisfying measure. My measure of success is, are we building the place we want to build? Which is a different way of saying what you just said. Does it capture our first principles? And when you focus on that, it changes how you make decisions. And it's very powerful. And yet, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. And I assume that's Shakespeare. Is it Shakespeare? Do you know?
Yeah, it is.
Where's it from? Do you know?
Richard II.
Okay, Richard II. Not in my wheelhouse.
It's okay. I couldn't tell you anything about sports, so don't worry about it.
Okay. Let's segue to the state of education more generally. The humanities in particular are in great decline over the last, I would say, 50 years in America. And they are under attack at the same time, which is quite a feat, actually. They are, I think, increasingly irrelevant, and yet the focus of much conversation and venom. What's wrong? What's gone wrong there? Do you have a thought on that?
I think there are several different ways to approach this question. Two come quickly to mind. On the one hand is, we've touched upon this earlier, the kind of the notion that the purpose of higher education is to prepare one for professional life. And that, the more narrowly that a degree or an experience at a college university tracks onto some sort of professional opportunity afterwards, the more valuable that is. So, the most common major in the United States is business. Well, I think that's just, it's not too hard to make the cognitive leap that if you study business, you get to do business. I mean, but the leap between history or philosophy or English or, the arts, music, et cetera, and what comes after, that's hard. And in a society where the price of higher education, both for students and families, and the cost of educating young people is increasing, exponentially, it feels like. There's a kind of risk calculation that's often made by students, whether or not they can afford to not have as direct a possible a through line from what they study in college to what comes after. So even if they love literature, they hesitate. I think that's part of the decline from the student side, let's say. I think in terms of the disciplinary side, look, the last great flowering of institution building in the United States, at least, was the end of the 19th century. And right, so that's when, and at the university level, you had Chicago and Stanford and Hopkins. And what was really happening in that moment was there's kind of the imposition of a new model, a new way of thinking about what a university is, sort of research model, the Humboldtian university, the kind of German imported model. And that changed the tenor of university life, but also the way that things like the humanities fit into university life. If the end point of a university is to produce knowledge through something called research, and that is a kind of, let's say, umbrella expectation for all professors, scholars, maybe even students who are affiliated with that institution, that changes the telos of the humanities. The idea that you do research in the humanities and you produce something that's narrowly scholarly is all that comes from being in the shadow of the hard sciences where that makes sense. And I think over time the accumulation of this kind of attitude that the job of professors is not to interrogate text in the way that we were talking about earlier, to ask big questions in life, or to sort of inculcate in students kind of passion for the subject matter, or kind of experience as broadly as possible their subject, but rather that their purpose is to supersede the scholars who have come before by producing scholarship that advances something called knowledge. I mean, that whole twist and turn, I think, over time has not served the humanities and kind of left it a kind of cold and arid place.
I think that's a great way to think about it. I think about the politicization of the humanities, which is not unrelated to it, but it's really a different point. Maybe we'll talk about that too in a minute. But I want to come back to this idea of research. The irony, I'm in Israel right now doing this crazy weird thing called being a college president, which I never aspired to. And to be honest, between you and me, don't tell anybody, Pano, but I never really respected the activity so much. But it's growing on me. I'm having a good time. But for years I taught at mainstream American research universities, University of Rochester, UCLA, Stanford, Washington University, and St. Louis, and George Mason. And the irony is that in most of those places, not all, but in most of them, the best researchers did the least teaching. So and sometimes none. And what that meant was that this original ideal that you would be taught by a master, not just someone who's familiar with the text, say, as in the way we've been talking about, read it many times, but someone who has contributed to the fundamental base of knowledge in the discipline under discussion, and therefore you would learn from a master. The problem, of course, is that a lot of times those people can't teach well, such as life, and they're not interested in teaching. They don't have to, because they're so valuable in terms of the research money that they bring in. The university uses them for other purposes. And so the idea, they're in the same building as your actual teachers, but they're not teaching you. And when they do, they don't necessarily do it very well, because there are no consequences of doing it poorly. They're not going to get fired for being bad teachers. What a strange thing.
I mean, it's really, when you sort of step back from what the university system has evolved into, you realize how odd it is. I mean, think about it this way. I mean, look, scholarship is a valuable thing. Like, I think it's having people write books, and having scientists do research, and and social scientists think about social topics and issues. And I think there's a lot of value to that. But the idea that somehow universities are the place where that activity happens at a very sort of high, often abstract level, and then we process 18-year-olds for 4 years through this institution that's doing that in a bid to somehow prepare them for the rest of their life. How does somebody thinking deeply about an article about Beowulf, intersect with, a 19-year-old who's, sort of moving through the system and thinking about that first job and starting a family, and that there seems to be such a gap between that higher level, let's say, intellectual activity that's important, and the kind of experiential activity that we want to produce for students, and sort of finding a way to narrow that gap or bridge that gap, I think, is a challenge that is increasingly important for schools to take on.
Well, there's one more inconsistency we haven't mentioned. It's tragicomic. I'm giggling, but it's tragicomic, which is the people doing the research often don't know very much. What they know a lot about is the academic research that they're trying to add to. They don't necessarily know so much about the actual real world and how that research might be used and how their students might go on to be in that world. So we have these pre-professional degrees sitting inside these silos where what's happening in the classroom is almost by definition alienated vis-a-vis the actual experience that's going to come. This is worse. It's in its worst guise in schools of education, I think, but it happens in business schools. Law school, obviously, is another place where this happens. There's an urge on the part of the faculty to be like the other faculty, doing great thinking and doing abstract thinking that you're talking about. But for the students, that doesn't serve them necessarily well in the practical side, the day-to-day side. So in theory, they're taking a pre-professional degree, but they're not getting a pre-professional training. So it's a bizarro thing.
I mean, and maybe it's fine. I guess it would be fine if we were clear about what we were trying to achieve. So maybe it is a good thing to take a group of, young people who are, becoming adults and separate them from the world and push aside kind of quotidian cares and the idea of what, professions and that, and have them focus on Beowulf and syntactical questions, in Beowulf. Maybe that's a good thing in terms of their, intellectual development, in terms of maybe moral and development and character development. But we need to be clear about what's happening if that's what we're doing. And I think part of the problem is we sort of very awkwardly try to split the difference and say that, somehow that's part of the activity that we're committed to, yet we're going to also make sure that you can do computer coding when you leave. And, I think there needs to be some clarity there. The liberal education has traditionally leaned in, I think, two different directions. And what I mean by liberal education, liberal arts education, I think is still the beating heart of the American system of higher education, however you construe institutions. And, on the one hand, the purpose was seen to be to produce philosophers, broadly construed people who did what I just said, sort of withdrew from the world, thought big thoughts about big things, and, we achieved, a step or two towards, wisdom, et cetera. And that was kind of the end. On the other hand were the orators, right? The people who were educated to engage in civil life and, people of action. And the world was preparing for them to engage in the world. And there's always been a kind of tension between these two trends in higher education. And I think some institutions lean one way, some lean the other. Some are kind of in a muddled, middle ground. I think just some clarity about what the purpose of the education being offered is at each institution is really critical to providing the kind of education that the students come there to receive.
So that's a good segue to your newest project, which is you are the president in waiting. I don't know what your exact title is, you can tell us, but you're the founder and president in waiting of a new idea for a college in Austin, Texas. Tell us about that. A lot of people see it as a response. It's generated an immense amount of conversation and interest in all kinds of places. A lot of people see it as a response to a different kind of crisis on the American campus we haven't talked about yet, which is the so-called woke movement, the sudden dislike for freedom of speech in the one place where freedom of speech used to be sacrosanct, which actually makes me cry. It makes me extremely sad and uncomfortable. Tell us about that project and what's going on. Where is it at now? What was its original idea? Where is it going?
So yeah, we're building towards a university in Austin. We have a kind of merry band of brothers and sisters who who are working on this project together. Started last year and have gained significant traction, and hope to be admitting students sooner rather than later, maybe within a couple of years. Some people do characterize this project because we've sort of stood up and boldly said the primary function of a university is the fearless pursuit of truth. Not the acquisition of truth, but the pursuit of truth. And people see that as in conflict with what's happening in many institutions now, to some degree or another, maybe in all institutions, that some characterize as wokeness and all that. And they say you're building the anti-woke university. First of all, you don't build an institution to be against anything. That makes no sense to me. Okay, you build an institution for something, for a vision. You always have to have a North Star, right? You have to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. We talked a little bit about this earlier, when you were saying what the purpose of Shlom was, right? You're building towards something. I think, what I would characterize as kind of the illiberal trends on campus, the restrictions on speech, the breakdown of civil discourse. I think these are not the problem or problems. They're symptoms of a greater problem. And the greater problem is a kind of a systemic disintegration of higher education as a whole. The principles of higher education that we now see being compromised are compromised because of other things happening in higher education. I would say that the financial model of higher education is failing. And this creates a kind of, the whole structure is sort of, wobbly and weakening. I mean, there's some institutions that are, invulnerable, but those are few. Most are always feeling, as we were talking about earlier, that the need to keep the lights on. And so, so that leads to kind of, in many cases, a compromise in principles. And then I think the other primary issue that higher education in the U.S. is facing today is something we also touched on. Universities, there hasn't really been a rethinking of the model of universities since that late 19th century moment when that research model was imposed upon the U.S. system, and the most prestigious universities were the research universities, and even universities that are characterized, say, as liberal arts universities. Are in many ways, just sort of, variations of that theme. Their professors are still doing research and belong to guilds and all that. So, we really haven't thought carefully about the curricular structure of higher education in over a century. And I think the strain of a system that's kind of not in tune with the moment that we live in is another reason that you see these kind of eruptions of illiberalism on campus. And I'd give an example. The topic we were just talking about, the kind of the trying to find a way to create an institution that fuses the impulse of the philosophers and the orators. Right? How do you bring together the thinkers and the doers? How do you create in young people thoughtful people of action? Right? I don't know any university that's sort of conceptualizing that now. That's that's framing things. That's what we're trying to do. We're literally trying to think about that very issue. How do you create the next generation of leaders, of innovators and builders who are grounded in a wisdom-oriented liberal arts education, but also prepared to be active in the world, that they sort of acquire knowledge and skills that kind of give them put some wind in their sails as they graduate, give them direction, prepare them to face challenges. How do you put those things together? How do you synthesize that? And so I think that's the primary curricular issue that we're facing today. And most institutions are sclerotic. They can't change. For example, I said earlier, I think the age of the college major is ending. Of course it is. I don't know the exact statistics. I'll just use some broad numbers, but something like 50 or 60% of the jobs that graduates today will be working on in 20 years don't exist right now. Right? They don't exist. We don't know what they're going to be doing. So, how do we have kind of majors and pre-professional programs that are preparing them for flourishing for the rest of their life? That's a challenge. And you think about these kind of these kind of fractures now and between what a university is intended to do and what its graduates need to flourish in society. And I think all of this is a kind of bundle of issues, and then the illiberalism is a kind of eruption that comes from the fractures from within the institutions systemically.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think it's really interesting. I don't usually think of it that way. I think of it more as the import of other problems elsewhere in America, for example, into the halls of all of its institutions, of which universities are just one of them. And so it's not surprising that too has become a performance area where, for these traits, where the leaders of the institutions, akin to what Yuval Levin said here, talking about people see their platform as a performance opportunity rather than a responsibility. And I think those two things together are, for me, what's creating a lot of the problems that no one has the incentive, particularly, to stand up and say, stay or stop. One of them, maybe both. Stay in the old sense of the word, I think, which is another challenge for Shakespeare, by the way, is that stay doesn't mean stay exactly in Shakespeare's time, I suspect. Wonderful book by George Steiner, wonderful set of observations by George Steiner about how translation is inherent in all languages, even within a language, because the language has evolved. And so Shakespeare, it's obvious. He also uses Noel Coward in the 1920s as an example of how his language is not so accessible to us in a sense, fundamental way we're translating it also. Mm-hmm. But that's within a language. But so that's the way I see it. I don't quite see it as a symptom of decay or instability. So I think there will be something of a reckoning. But I'm not sure it's going to be necessarily along the lines you're suggesting. But I might be wrong. It's just interesting to think about. You can respond to that if you want.
Yeah, well, I think I agree with you. But the question is, if what's happening at universities is sort of being imported from the outside, why are universities vulnerable to this? In other words, the places that had been committed to principles of free speech and academic freedom and civil discourse and that are now vulnerable, where they should be resistant to it.
Exactly.
And so that's where I'm saying the problem is when you're financially unstable or you don't have a very robust sense of your purpose, that these things come in through the cracks. And it's that instability that has allowed the very institutions that should be modeling other ways of being, other ways of conversing, other ways of thinking about the world, to be infiltrated. And of course, the irony, is most of this stuff that we're talking about here politically was germinated in universities to begin with, and then entered the culture, and then circled back around.
Yes.
So so that I think that's part of it as well. And I think back to the notion that universities kind of got off the rails when they started focusing on scholarly one-upsmanship. The path towards academic success was to be transgressive, to say the thing that nobody had said before, to push the boundaries, and that, particularly in France, but also in the English sphere, that was the opening for a lot of the theorists in the mid-century, mid-20th century, the 60s, to be not only accepted into the academy, but to be lionized by the academy. So all these things interconnect. But the great question is, why are universities not more resistant? Why are universities not the institutions that are showing us a better way?
That's an excellent point. I would just add one thing, which is that as an economist, I tend to think about skin in the game and incentives, and who's got the incentives is not unrelated to the Yuval Levin point about your incentives to use your platform as a place to perform rather than a place to be responsible. But I also think it has a lot to do with what we expect of our children as they mature leave high school and go through this weird period called college, at least, I went to college in the 70s. None of us thought of college as a place to get a job, or none of my friends thought of that. But we also didn't think of it as a place we were going to grow and be transformed. It was just, it was 4 years of something interesting to, it's a way station. And we don't teach, I'm exaggerating, but a lot probably. But I think certainly as, I've told this story before on EconTalk, a colleague of mine in an institution I will not name, but I've already listed the possible options, was told me he was on the committee for education and he had to do such and such for it on such and such a day. And I said, what do you mean the committee for education? Well, it's the part of the university that focuses on the learning. I said, yeah, that used to be more than just a committee. It kind of used to be the whole thing. But 2022, or at the time, whatever it was, that wasn't the case anymore. And that, I think, is also part of it. Now, that came to be very, very, and it's very, very far from the mission that you were involved with at St. John's or I'm involved with at Shlom. It's a different kind of experience that we're trying to prepare and have the students experience, a different kind of training, a different kind of expectations of what the result of it will be. Both, you said it beautifully, philosophers and orators, thinkers and doers, thoughtful people of action. That's what we're trying to do here at Shlom. It's obviously an ideal. That's not what 18-year-olds in America go to college for. Or at least no one tells them that. It happens because it's the nature of human beings and the nature of life, but no one goes in with that expectation. It's weird.
I think students go in with the expectation that college will be a value add for them, that they're at the end of it, they'll have earned something, gained something that will propel them forward.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's not a perfect analogy, but in some ways, I think of going to college today, particularly elite universities, as as kind of going to like the court of Louis XIV. These students are kind of courtiers, right? They sort of show up in these opulent places and they spend time there and they learn manners and they kind of learn how to perform properly. And it's all in the service of trying to gain access to power and wealth. And success is learning the rules. Success is learning how to navigate. Success is learning what to say and what not to say. Success is learning how to, find your way in the back door. So in many ways, our elite universities operate like, kind of modern version of a court. And so, when you exit there, how have you been transformed? Maybe not fundamentally, internally, profoundly, but you've been transformed to somebody who's prepared for the next stage in being a courtier, which is that first job at the Goldman Sachs or whatever it is.
It's one of the most cynical things I think I've ever heard on this program, which is saying something. It reminds me of this. It's a trope in movies where one of my favorite movies of all time is Scent of a Woman, and it's set in an elite private school, and there's a student there who, quote, doesn't belong. He belongs, but he's not of the world of the other students. He's poor, he's on scholarship, and he's desperately eager to get access to the language, the mores, the clothes. And that's school as finishing school, as the court, as you say. I don't think it's like that at every university. It certainly wasn't that way for my children who went to Yeshiva University, Stern College, and the University of Maryland. But those are not the high courts of Western royalty, fortunately. So what's going to be distinctive about what you do at Austin? So we didn't mention it, but St. John's has two campuses, one in Annapolis and one in Santa Fe. Are you going to be St. John's in the Midwest with a different name? You're going to have a core curriculum? You're going to have great books? What's going to be different?
No. Some of the DNA from St. John's is being incorporated into the new institution. Again, we're sort of beginning with that starting point of how do we create thoughtful doers? The kind of, the thought exercise that I ask my my team to go through when we think about the kind of graduates you want to produce, which is, when you start thinking about that, you backwards engineer the curriculum that you want to develop. I say, assume that every student who leaves here is going to hold significant power of some sort over the course of life. Just make that assumption. Not that that's the end, but assumption. What do you want to do to prepare them for that? If we're building the next generation of leaders, of innovators, and builders and that, how do we want to prepare them to do that? Both in terms of how do we want to make them successful in their endeavors, but what kind of people do we want to prepare who will who will be influential over time? So thinking about those things together. And so right now, our curriculum, this is either a really elegant solution or it's really clumsy. I don't know which it is yet. And Leon Cass is helping me figure that out. We've sort of literally divided the 4 years of the undergraduate experience in two, so that the first 2 years is primarily a kind of what we call the intellectual foundations program, a kind of common intellectual journey, a core that students will experience together in cohorts, reading great books in humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, not exclusively seminar based. We do think there's room to learn history through lectures and other sort of, those things can be incorporated. But, it has kind of the spirit, let's say, of a great books program, but isn't as narrowly construed as a place like St. John's construes that. And there'll also be some opportunity for some what we call practica around those. So if you want to start learning how to code, or you want to be working on Arabic or things while you're doing this, there'll be opportunities. So you do that for 2 years. And then at the end of 2 years, you spend a part of your last semester developing what we call your Polaris project. Polaris project, Polaris is the North Star. What do you want to aim for? What is it that you're most passionate about? And we want students to pick something massive, something seemingly unachievable, and that's what they're going to focus on for the next 2 years during their time at the university. So it could be something like, you're going to compose a symphony in honor of lost languages, or you're going to engineer a new automated system to deliver viral antidotes in countries that are compromised, or whatever it is, something really big. And then you have to kind of plan out, so here's what I want to achieve. How do I approach that question? How do I approach that problem? And you have the next 2 years at the university navigating the resources of the university to move in that direction. And we don't anticipate that students are going to all complete their projects. What we're most interested in seeing is how far they get, or what changes along the way, or what they learn along the way. That kid who started off writing a symphony may take a computer coding class and end up, writing a digital program to compose music or something like that. And that's where they end up going. But we want to give them directionality. We want to give them ambition. We want them to think about the purpose of their education. So you're not learning just to learn. You're learning to achieve something that has importance to you and to others. So the second 2 years, the third and fourth year of the undergraduate experience, we're not going to have traditional departments. We're dividing the university now into 5 what we call centers of inquiry that are broadly thematic. So there's a center for politics, economics, and applied history, a center for education and public service, center for math, engineering, and technology, et cetera. And each of those centers are much larger than a department would be. The faculty there are from across disciplines. The faculty are not necessarily scholars, but also working on their own Polaris projects, which could be writing a book, but could be doing lots of other things. And so students will pick one of those 5 centers to be a junior fellow in. When in accord with the project that they're working on. They can take classes anywhere they want, but they'll be a junior fellow in one of those centers. Those centers will have their kind of own core curriculum that the students will progress through, or maybe a few different pathways. So as you can see, it's a radically different model than you'd find at most 4-year universities today. But it is, as I said, it's either really elegant or really clumsy and awful. We're still developing the curriculum. So this is our kind of, this is right now, I would say, the architecture that we've come up with. We'll see where it goes.
It's a blue sky aspect to it, obviously. I think it's going to sell like hotcakes. That means sell well. I don't think it'll be clumsy. I think I like to think that most of my listeners, about 2/3 or maybe a little more than 2/3, are English speaking. And I like to think they'd all want to come to Shlom if they spoke Hebrew. But you're going to be teaching in English. So I think it's going to be a very, very attractive option for two reasons. One, you will have the, I won't call it anti, but the non-woke, at least to start with. It'll be hard to maybe preserve your distinctiveness. I think every institution struggles with that. But the idea that you're doing something different, it's a little scary. It'll be a little risky, but that's kind of good because you'll attract people who find that appealing rather than frightening. And so I think you'll do quite well. What's your do you have a thought on what your relationship with your faculty will be? Will you have tenure? A lot of people have expressed eagerness to teach at this new place. Which is lovely.
We received something like 4,000 inquiries from faculty at other institutions in the first couple of weeks, which was it was affirming. The question of tenure is an important one. I think in general, higher education is moving away from tenure. That doesn't necessarily dictate the choices that we make. I think we have to think about what aspects of tenure have made universities better places, and which aspects of tenure have been pernicious. Let's say one of the problems with tenure is that the system, as it's currently construed in most places, is built so that senior faculty hire junior faculty, hire their peers, and then assess them over time, and then determine whether or not they get to join the club at the end.
Yeah.
And so what that does over time is we see it ratcheting in one direction in terms of politics or ideology. I think most faculty, the super majority of faculty that I know, are like well-intentioned people and don't have agendas and aren't trying to do anything, but there's a kind of natural gravitation towards those that you're most comfortable with. And so what happens over time, you see faculty leaning in one way towards one end of the political spectrum. And I think that destabilizes the institution. And so that's problematic. And why does it destabilize it? Well, if the purpose of higher education is in some ways not just knowledge, but the ability to self-reflect so that we understand ourselves as knowers, so that we know how we're learning to know.
What we don't know.
What we don't know, exactly, and what questions we should be asking. If we're not ourselves challenged by other opinions, by heterodox ideas, we can't see ourselves in three dimensions. We can accurately reflect upon our own biases, upon our own shortcomings, our own blind spots, and so it seems to me to majorly compromise the whole project of higher education. To not have a broad or the broadest set of perspectives available so that we can interact with each other and learn from one another about ourselves. I think that's important. So tenure, back to tenure, the way tenure is currently construed, the hiring process has really accelerated this what I think of as political asymmetry. And look, I will say categorically, the problem for me isn't that asymmetry in almost every institution leans left. It's that it's asymmetrical. So if the institution if it were to go to the opposite direction, that's not the solution. Mm-mm. That is not the solution. I understand why some institutions do react and create, a kind of, let's say, right-leaning institution, their own kind of bubble. I understand that impulse, but I don't think it solves the problem. So, so designing a tenure system that allows for a kind of permeability so that people of all different stripes, intellectual stripes, belief systems, political orientations, are accepted as full members into the community and judged according to the merits of what they're doing, not what they think, in that kind of political sense. To me, finding a way to solve for that in a tenure system is the most important piece of it. I don't mind so much the idea that faculty are protected for life. that they have this thing called academic freedom, so that if their opinions are heterodox, there isn't retaliation against them. I think that's important. The problem is that academic freedom is compromised if the system that you design to preserve academic freedom, it serves as a gatekeeper to limit the academic freedom of many of the people who want to enter the system.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that. Let's close with, I'll give you the challenge that I mentioned earlier that people have given me. You have a measure of success. If this project goes well, it gets off the ground, you get accredited, you admit students, you take their tuition, you graduate them in some version of what you've imagined will be the experience that they'll go through as students. How will you think about, or have you thought about, what success will look like?
I think a lot about this because, if the purpose of the institution, first and foremost, is to be grounded in the first principles of open inquiry and civil discourse, and that you're going to not only preserve this institution over time, but somehow these principles are transformative for the students that go through the system. How do you measure that? How do you assess that over time? How do you know? And so we're building into the university, as we're developing it, a kind of internal assessment system, a qualitative assessment system. We're thinking about when you bring students to the beginning, how do you capture them in that moment to understand how they understand the world, themselves, ideas, others, and then how do you, at the back end of their experience when they graduate, or maybe even after that, assess what kind of journey they've taken. And so we're thinking a lot about that, and we want to do this actively, and we don't actually want to take students in until we understand how we're going to assess success over time. But for me, success is knowing that when students leave, the kind of transformative education that we're hoping to provide for them has been effective to some measure.
Yeah, I think about, for our students, we don't do this now, but I'm thinking about ways to implement it. I really love the idea of journaling. That students reflect in a formal way about some aspect of life when they enter, and similarly when they leave. And to be shocked, let them be shocked by how different they are 4 years later. But having said that, I think that's a good idea. How you implement that is obviously not straightforward. But for me, ultimately, one of my colleagues says Shlom is a 40-year experience. Only the first 4 take place on campus. And now it's 3.5, we've become a 3.5-year program, but only the first 3.5 years take place here in the building and then on the campus and in the classroom. And then the rest is really the proof of whether we've done our job well. We understand that who we take in affects who comes out. So we're not the only influence. It's the clay that to me, it's, the students are the clay, but they are the potter also. Mm-hmm. They're the ceramicists. They get to mold themselves. We don't mold them. We give them the opportunity to mold themselves. And I'm pretty confident that if they have that freedom, they'll do great things when they leave. So I don't pretend to know what those might be out in the world.
I think I think that's wonderful. I love the idea of clay and molding, and what do we do what does an artist do with the raw materials at hand?
Yeah,
they take what's been given and shape it in a way that adds meaning.
Yeah. My guest today has been Pano Kanelos. Pano, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you so much, Russ. This was a great pleasure. Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.